Hi everybody, Paul Kengor, John Gizzi here, and
Hi, everyone.
we are taping from the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, and it's probably, I guess it's March 1st today, and neither one of us could be at the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference, unfortunately, this year for the 30th anniversary of it. That's because we have a conference at the Center for Vision and Values in Grove City College, which overlapped right over the PLC, unfortunately. But we figured we'd tape this statement, kind of a little discussion for people to watch, so you could really enjoy your breakfast with this fabulous, stimulating, highbrow intellectual conversation here. But anyway, so how you doing? Good?
I'm doing great, and I join with Paul in expressing my regrets at being unable to join you at the 30th PLC. I was at the first one, which was a long time back, and it certainly is bittersweet to speak to you by tape and not in person. I am at the Catholic Charities Gala in Washington, D.C., and our church has been under siege, as many of you know, and this will be an exciting time to hear new things about where Catholicism is going, at least in the District of Columbia.
Sure. Yeah, in the wake of the McCarrick situation and everything else. We can talk about that for probably 20 minutes, but we're only going to talk for a few minutes, so take us back to some of your memories then. The first
Sure.
PLC in 1989, did you have, that would have been the final year of the Reagan presidency. Well, Reagan final full year was 88, so he left in January 89. And that's the year the Berlin Wall fell, of all things, right? 30 years ago, oh my. Loman Henry is here, right? Loman, we're going to feel old. 30 years ago. And at that point, the Soviet Union still existed, but not for long. And that was that was the launch of the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference.
It certainly was, and one of the founding fathers of the PLC, Jim Panyard, asked me to be a panelist at the event. Now, one has to remember, in those days, there was no internet at the time. More people still used typewriters and printed newsletters on paper than communicated it through the unknown universe of cyberspace.
Yes, it's so true.
And
it's hard to even imagine that time, isn't it?
Yes, and so a lot of people, as enthusiastic as they were back in Harrisburg, just didn't have some of the information and equipment they needed. When I was on the panel, this was before White House press conferences and talk radio hit its stride, and Sue Staub of Right to Work, a founding mother of the event, said to me, "You're going to have to introduce yourself. I don't have anything on you." So I got up and said, "My name is John Gizzi. I'm a political reporter in Washington. There'll be a short pause for you to say, 'Who cares?'" And
well, the human events, right? You at
yes.
that point in time, that was your main.
Right. I was the political correspondent for Human Events, which was the oldest conservative news weekly in the United States, founded back in 1944.
Yeah, prior to National Review, prior to American Spectator, Weekly Standard, all of them.
All of them. It was the granddaddy. And of course, now I'm with Newsmax. But in those days, 1989, we were fortunate to have a speaker, a young congressman who had just been elected to leadership in the House, and his name was Newt Gingrich.
Yes.
And he was a star at that point, and someone with Pennsylvania roots, having been born and raised in the Pittsburgh area. I met his parents that night, and he motivated the crowd about how technology could be used to advance the conservative cause.
Classic Newt.
It started with a line I'll never forget. If you have a credit card, they're going to find you anywhere in the world.
Yes.
And he says, especially if you don't pay it.
Right.
So he led into the fact that technology and reaching people individually was going to be the wave of the future. Vintage Newt, as you say.
And that's 5 years before the Congress that he elected that became the Newt of history at that point.
And someone, and he might be there today, Congressman Bob Walker, introduced his close friend, Newt Gingrich. And Bob said a line that I frequently plagiarized from him. He said, "I bring you greetings from Washington, the work-free drug place."
The work-free drug place.
But it was a very good event. people such as John Kennedy, still a participant, was there. State Representative Howard Fargo, who graciously took me on a tour of the Capitol in Harrisburg, and Chris Moyer, who was on the same panel that I was. And I mention that name because most of you won't remember it. There are people who've gone on to other things and not stayed with PLC. Jim Panyard, Sue Staub aren't there anymore, but let's keep them in our hearts and spirit because they were present at the creation.
And the late, great Fred Anton as well. And now this is all in the hands of Loman Henry and Dave Taylor and their great work. But, we were talking to Loman right before we started the tape here, and a couple of other big name speakers. Stan Evans, the late Stan Evans. And I mean, people like that were coming in the earliest days of PLC.
Stan Evans, M. Stanton Evans, a friend of both of ours, and one of the founding fathers of the conservative movement. He signed the Sharon Statement at William Buckley's home in 1961.
A crucial statement.
I
mean, that ought to be printed, and we're going to be distributing that at no, we can't, probably. It'd be great to distribute that. That's the kind of thing that conservatives today, and wanting to know what conservatism is in a time of chaos about conservatism, need to go back and read that stuff.
Right. He went on to Indianapolis, where he became the youngest big city newspaper editor in the United States.
Right.
Gave up a secure career in journalism in 1976 to launch the National Journalism Center in Washington, which has trained so many interns that I've had, and a lot of people such as John Fund, who've gone on to greater things, Terry Moran, who's ABC correspondent, and Ann Coulter.
Right. In fact, it's interesting. We were in Capitol Hill yesterday with our Grove City College students, and we went up past the Supreme Court building and headed down toward the Heritage Foundation. I was telling them, I said, I remember meeting Stan Evans and Herb Romerstein right down that street in the building where they used to hold the National Journalism Center. And at that point, it had become a research group where he was researching communism and the Cold War.
Right.
And now Young America's Foundation runs it, the NJC. But that's Stan's creation.
It certainly was.
It's been a great thing.
And Stan gave a very warm and witty speech with his erudite humor that night.
Funny.
And one of his lines were, well, I really can't even do it and do justice to what Stan said, but let's just say this. There was a young man sitting next to me named Greg Rothman, and we were talking about Stan being from Indianapolis, the same hometown as the then Vice President Dan Quayle.
Sure.
And Greg said to me, I'll support Dan Quayle for president if he'll promise to make Stan Evans Secretary of State. And then he brought up Stan's book about the future of conservatism, in which he predicted, after Barry Goldwater's crushing defeat, that conservatism would rise and succeed. Greg had an original first edition, and no one was going to stop that young man from getting Stan Evans's autograph.
Right. And then you had to wait 16 years after the Goldwater defeat for Ronald Reagan in 1980.
Right.
And then the rest is history. And really so the first Pennsylvania Leadership Conference comes on the heels of those 8 years of Ronald Reagan.
Exactly.
Also, some of the first speakers at the PLC, Bill Bennett.
Bill Bennett was the third speaker.
The third speaker.
Senator Rick Santorum, while he was still a House member, I believe, came, and he was on the verge of being elected senator in the 1994 Republican Revolutionary
Which was
year.
a huge success for Rick Santorum. I think he defeated, was it Doug Walgren, I believe, right? Loman in western Pennsylvania. That was from Mount Lebanon area of Pittsburgh. That was a huge upset. No one thought at that point Rick Santorum, a no-name Republican, could defeat a Democrat in that Mount Lebanon area, but he did it.
And one little thing about how much I've learned from my friends in Pennsylvania, it was a young man from Erie County who was involved in local politics and knew Rick from YRs, who pleaded with me, you've got to do a Race of the Week fixture and highlight my friend's Rick's campaign against Doug Waldron.
Interesting.
And his name was Phil English.
Wow, Phil English, who was my congressman in Grove City, Pennsylvania. And I remember being in 1989, of all things, at the Pitt News. That was at the University of Pittsburgh. I was an undergrad, I was the editorial page editor, and the YRs, the college Republicans, Tara Fito was her name. She came up to me and she said, there's this lawyer from Mount Lebanon who's running against Doug Walgren. His name is Rick, and she pulled Santorum or something like that. And can we have him come speak to our Republican chapter? I said, yeah, he's not going to win, but if you want to bring him in, go ahead. And he came in, he blew everybody away.
He did.
And we thought, wow, if somebody could pull this off, it might well be this guy. And then he ends up, of all things, having a great presidential run in 2008 or 2012. Effectively coming in second, right? Runner-up that year for the nomination.
He was the anti-Romney.
He was the anti-Romney.
Right. And one other thing, it is a fact that the PLC had a couple of bad years. Fred Anton told me flat out that we don't have as much money as we did to generate support. The conservative movement during the years of Bob Casey as governor was flailing and discouraged about the future. And sure enough, it took the candidacy of a young congressman named Pat Toomey when he challenged none other than Arlen Specter in 2004.
That's right, that was a big year.
And I would liken that to Ronald Reagan challenging the sitting president, Gerald Ford, in the sense he didn't win, but he electrified conservatives, motivated them, and then prepared them for the future. Pat Toomey did the same thing in 2004. He lost by 1 vote per precinct, heavily outspent, and with the President of the United States, George W. Bush, campaigning for Arlen Specter, Pat was always a gentleman, and he endorsed Specter the next day despite their differences, and he lived to fight another day.
Sure.
A lot of defeated politicians should learn from that.
That's right. I remember too, one of my favorite moments, it might have been the year or two after that, I'm trying to think the exact year, but Michael Reagan was there.
Yes.
And we did, I did a Q&A with Michael Reagan on the stage. I think we must have went 2 hours with that moment, and we finally had to cut it off. I don't know if you remember this, but I and Mike Reagan went back to his suite and stayed up until probably about 2 o'clock in the morning.
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock, just hearing some amazing stories from Mike, including about Nancy Reagan. And Mike wasn't the biggest fan of Nancy, and I don't know if I should even share or quote some of what he said there, but it was kind of Mike unmiked, and that was one of the most interesting nights I've ever had at the PLC.
It was fascinating. Mike was holding court with an audience of 2 that's here, but with that audience, he was a superstar, and the insider stories he had and things he talked about his father, and he said when his father lost to Gerald Ford, and you may remember this, Paul, he said the one thing he regretted was that he was never going to be able to sit across the table from Brezhnev in the next 4 years and say, "Niet."
Niet. That's right. So he got to say it to Gorbachev in 1986. And in fact, we're saying that right now after President Trump had maybe a moment like that with Kim in Vietnam yesterday. And in fact, let's bring this up to where we are today. So where do you think the conservative movement stands now? I mean, in the Trump era, again, we're taping here at CPAC, and if you walked around this room and asked 10 different random people for a definition of conservatism, you'd probably get 10 different answers.
And this is one thing that I, as a longtime participant in PLC, always learn. I never fail to make new friends whenever I go every year and stay a few days in Harrisburg for this conclave of conservatism. There are pro-life conservatives, pro-family conservatives, libertarian conservatives, economic and small government conservatives, and of course the new / nationalist populist conservatives. Now the fact is, do we argue? Sure. A big family is likely to have a few disputes now and then, particularly when one member thinks he or she is smarter than the other, which often happens. But the fact is, the conservative movement continues to grow. People will tell you, oh, The Republican Party is dying under Donald Trump. People are going. I'm not going to debate that, but I know this. CPAC this year had the most participants of all at its national event in Washington, D.C.
And they're young.
And they're young.
Very young.
And PLC continues to grow, and spiritually, the young people are what keeps me growing. Yes, there's different shades of conservatism. Maybe one day there'll be 50 different shades of conservatism,
right.
But the same principles that we learned from Reagan, Buckley, Goldwater, M. Stanton Evans stay the same. Smaller government, and to use a title of one of Stan's great books, the theme is freedom.
The theme is freedom. You got it. I think that's probably a good place to stop.
Yeah.
So I think, and thank you everybody. Hope you have a good time, and maybe John and I can be there next year.
I hope you'll invite us.
Live and in person, and maybe we could do it live, but not at 7 o'clock in the morning, Loman. All right,
No.
a little later in the day. All right, but we hope you enjoyed this with your orange juice and bacon and eggs. Thanks everybody.
Keep the faith.